Redditors who work at cemeteries and graveyards, what strange and scary stuff have you witnessed? In the cemetery mausoleum chapel where I occasionally play the organ for funerals, vandals had broken in the night before a service. They smashed several crypt covers, probably with sledgehammers, exposing the remains of those that had been entombed therein. It was an eerie atmosphere to hold a funeral service that morning with such desecration in plain sight. My dad purchased a cemetery when I was in middle school, and I worked for him through high school graduation. I did yard work, mowing, weed eating, flower beds, etc. Aside from the occasional shadows seen out of the corner of my eye, seeing people who turned out to not be there, and hearing strange sounds, the cemetery was actually a quite peaceful place. But the strangest is when you have a burial in the crypts. Basically, you dig down about 4 or 5 feet to expose giant cement doors. You pull the cement doors off and drop down into a little room. These rooms can fit 2 coffins or years and years and years worth of cremated remains. So back in the 50s and 60s, families would buy 1 crypt and the entire fam would be cremated and put in it. Some just put the cremated remains in it and close her up, but others light candles and leave flowers and souvenirs and pictures and shit. It's fucking creepy opening up one of those bad boys after 50 years and finding melted candles and old pictures of the people inside. Plus when you hop down in there you have a weird realization that you are at the same level and completely surrounded by bodies. We had a late afternoon service once that ran into the evening. It was October, so the sun went down early while I was filling in the grave afterwards. Conveniently none of the lights on the loader tractor worked for some reason. No blown fuses or loose wires or anything, the lights just didn't work. Next day when I reported the issue we went over to the same tractor and the lights worked perfectly fine, and they worked fine the rest of the time I worked there. My school was by a graveyard and I'd have to pass it to get from the library to my apartment. I would be getting back at 1 or 2 AM. Every time I walk by I would see a light on the grave. I figured someone added a light to their loved one's grave, thought it was weird, and joked about it with my roommates when I would get home. After a few months of seeing it, I had friends in town and we were exploring the area, so we decided to go into the cemetery. We couldn't find the grave with the light on it. We searched for a while before they shrugged it off. The next day I walked by and there the small green light was beaming again. I didn't want to jump the fence alone just to investigate. So I dragged my roommate out and once more we couldn't find the light. Even when we wakes by it, they couldn't see the light. No matter what, I saw that light walking by. Grew up across the street from a graveyard. There are a ton of people in there at night. Some are prostitutes turning tricks. Some are drug deals. Some are grieving families saying goodnight to a lost loved one. I also lived near a huge cemetery as a kid. Basically our little cul-de-sac neighborhood backed up to it, so the houses across from us had a cemetery on the other side of a little wood strip behind their house. We used to go take walks in there a lot. One time though some older girls that used to babysit me were walking in the cemetery about twilight heading home and found a dead body. It was a murdered guy left out in the cemetery. We were assuming it was some sort of drug deal gone wrong or mafia thing and they dumped him their way back up in the cemetery because no witnesses and no cameras etc to see them dump the body. Well, my dad worked at a funeral home and I'm telling his story. One day about a year ago I was super bored and so I asked him about his days working at this funeral home. He tells me this story is not twisted to make it weird, it really happened like this. So some older lady had passed away due to old age symptoms or something. And her twin sister was the only person left at the church place where they did the celebration of life ceremony. And while my dad was walking around cleaning up, TBH I don't exactly know what my dad did there because he didn't tell me. And when this happened I was like 2. He overheard her talking to herself. He walked behind her trying to listen in without her noticing, and she was saying some shit like, "I shouldn't be here and my time's up." My dad was freaked out by this and asked her if she was okay. She turned around and said no. The next day she was found dead by her caretakers in her room. She had overdosed on her prescription. Neither of them were married, and I think my dad said they worked until they were like 70. Not really a cemetery story, but still pretty freaky. My great-great-grandfather and his son were foremen at the cemetery in my hometown, of course way before I was ever around. The older of them was said to be sensitive, as in he felt and saw things, and there are stories of people that he buried that came by during nights to tell him that they were cold, which means that there were no flowers/wreaths on the grave, or that their feet were cold. The soil around where the foot of the casket was had leveled. He was also said to be able to see people in what we refer to as Hamford skin journey, as in the body shows itself to tell someone that the soul has departed. One particular story about that they still tell around the Sunday dinner table is when a friend of his had been lost at sea. Nobody knew of course until much later, but my 2xg grandfather saw his friend entering the house drenched in seawater and noisily walk into the living room and sits himself on an old sailor's chest that was by the door, and just as soon the man disappears. My great grandfather took over his father's job when he got too old to do it. I can't remember any similar stories about him, but there is a joke about some youngsters that tried to scare him that people have told all over the country, probably an imported joke. There were a few people in town that didn't like the fact that the graveyard workers worked after dark, and there were a group of young men that decided that enough was enough. They were going to scare the gravedigger. So they outfitted themselves with white sheets and went to the graveyard and walked around the graveyard saying all sorts of ghostly sounds like boo, and they found the gravedigger as he was in the middle of digging a grave by hand, and they stood around the grave for what seemed like hours, shouting and screaming and doing whatever it is that ghosts do. The gravedigger paid them no mind and just continued with his work. The young men then, having given up, started to leave, and as they approached the gate of the graveyard they could hear shouting and protesting behind them, as the gravedigger angrily came running towards them, shouting, "It's one thing that you are up and about walking around here, but don't you think for a second that I will allow you to leave?" I used to do some odd jobs at the 12th century graveyard in my hometown. 12th century, as in the church and its surrounding graveyard had been in continuous use for at least that long. When you keep burying bodies in the same small patch of ground for that many centuries, eventually the soil has been turned over dozens of times and consists mainly of bone fragments. You can't even plant flowers there without accidentally uncovering some teeth or finger bones or something. It's nothing but fragmented skeletons all the way down under the thin turf. The soil sort of resembles seaside shell sand, except on closer examination all the light colored bits are bone fragments, rather than crushed seashells. Not really scary or unexpected, just a bit eerie, until you get used to it. You learn to treat anything recognizable as human remains with respect, and just tuck it away out of sight under the plant, or whatever else you were putting there. When I was in college I worked part-time at a Jewish cemetery in reception/office management. The cemetery was closed from Friday afternoon through Saturday evening for Sabbath. We sometimes stayed a bit later in the office on Friday afternoons to get bills out or checks processed. We heard a loud commotion by the cemetery entrance which was locked, and only staff could get in and out. The office manager went to see what was going on and made me come with her. We went down to the gate to find an older woman, probably around 70, dressed to the nines begging us to let her in. She kept saying she needed to get back. This was in the suburbs of NJ, so you needed a car to get around, but we didn't see a car or anything. She was just there in this beautiful dress. We couldn't open the gate without the cemetery manager, so we went to go get him. We brought him back to the gate and no one was there. We looked at video footage of the entrance and you could see us, the office manager and me, talking, but there was no one on the other side of the gate. The cemetery manager thought we were trying to trick him. I swear to this day we saw a woman in a fancy dress outside that gate. There were multiple cameras, and not a single one picked up anyone on the other side of the gate, and you could see the whole gate. All you could see was us. I don't know if it was a ghost or what. The office manager and I decided not to tell anyone else, but we would mention it to each other every once in a while. My dad was a cemetery superintendent, so we were in residence there from the time I started high school. I lived there with my parents for about 5 years. My dad worked in the same cemetery and lived there for 35 years. There's nothing strange or scary in a cemetery. They can actually be very peaceful, idyllic places. Anything that would be strange or scary is brought there by your own preconceptions and expectations. You can stretch the symbols of old worn tombstones, the shapes of trees in the seasons, the mists and fogs of weather, to scare yourself. It was human, very much alive, agency that was scary. It was 160 acres in the middle of the city. Tons of kids roamed that place at night. They drank and fucked all over the place. They also committed acts of vandalism. One night, a group went through and knocked over 160 plus tombstones.